Welcome to Bickering over board games, where we discuss trends in board games and how we feel about them. My name's Brett.
I'm Kaylee.
And this week, my original plan was to talk about games in the public IP, right? So classic literature that's been classically used for a lot of classic board games, such as Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective.
It's just fun.
And
you do feel like you're solving a Sherlock Holmes case. It's nice to have things that people can draw for inspiration, but also I do think that there's a fine line for not just slapping a theme that is public domain onto a game.
Like all the Sherlock Holmes themes we've seen come through.
So if you're going to use something that's been used 1,000 times before, just make sure that it thematically makes sense and mechanically makes sense.
Right, like Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, the original designers of that game, you could tell that they loved Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
And which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it. Here's the thing, though. Originally, the first edition that was originally published in French, I think, was released in 1983.
Yeah.
But turns out that Sherlock Holmes was actually not in the public domain until
2014.
We also have this 221B Baker Street, which is, I love this game. We got it at a thrift store for $3. It's amazing. And it's basically like if you've ever played Watson and Holmes, the sort of competitive version of Consulting Detective. It's very similar to that.
When was Watson and Holmes?
I think it's pretty modern, I don't know.
2015.
2015, Watson and Holmes. I should really look into the publishing history of...
we learned our lesson.
But certainly, we've seen more Sherlock Holmes games. This is basically Hanabi, Sherlock Holmes themed. But it's interesting that there are a couple, that the two games we really wanted to talk about are from before that. And so I started looking into copyright and public domain and intellectual property, and it's actually really complicated and weird. So for instance, Shadows over Camelot.
Yeah. What's it based on?
Okay, so King Arthur, right?
Yeah.
Which is clearly in the public domain. King Arthur is, right? Because it's from the Middle Ages. And yet, here's the thing. Modern or contemporary iterations of King Arthur then leave the public domain. And then, of course, there's a difference between copyright and trademarks. I'm sure Shadows over Camelot is now trademarked. Bram Stoker's Dracula is well within the public domain. But then once something becomes Fury of Dracula, well, first of all, this would be like trademarked. And obviously, this is now an intellectual property in and of itself, right? And sadly, Games Workshop and Fantasy Flight did not resolve their differences. And so... this third edition won't be reprinted, but I guess Games Workshop announced another edition or potentially a reprint with WizKids. So hold on to your third edition, boys and girls.
I think that it's nice to have, for example, Sherlock Holmes. Your parents like Sherlock Holmes, so we can play that game with them, and they're very hard people to get to play a board game.
What I think is interesting is when these, let's call them quasi-public domain IPs, become refined into something like Fury of Dracula, or like the Fantasy Flight's Arkham Horror. It's almost like it becomes its own IP. You know what I mean?
Which is kind of cool.
It is cool.
Because...
I should mention that Fantasy Flight bought the rights from another company called Chaosium that originally produced Call of Cthulhu. I did a lot of research after we shot the first one. To doing research. Ahead of, before we shoot the review.
You would think we'd be better at it because we're grad students.
She explained the video quality.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about how you associate Cthulhu with Jenny Barnes. I think it's like the best example of that.
She's cooler than Cthulhu.